picked the most famous part of the story. It's the homecoming called the prodigal son. If you have darkened the door of a church more than 2 or 3 times, you've probably heard the story. Let me read you just the first couple of verses here. It's found in Luke chapter 15. In verse 11, Jesus is talking and he says, "There was once a man who had 2 sons. And the younger one said to him, 'Father, give me my share of the property now.' So the man divided his property between his 2 sons. And after a few days, the younger son sold his part of the property and left with the money." I don't think he liked being at home. He got as far away from home as he could get. I think some of us do that too. There are a lot of things about life that are just hard to figure out. But the rest of the story goes on, and it says that he went to a distant land, and he was foolish with his money. He spent it all. And then a famine and a depression hit, and he ended up doing the worst possible job from a Jewish boy's point of view, slopping hogs and being envious of what they were eating. And then a key point of the story happens. It says that he came to himself, came to his senses. And he thought, well, this is just stupid. I should get up and go home. In his mind, this just starts to be filled with the idea of going home. And he begins to think, how am I going to do that? Can I even go home? And he constructs this deal that he wants to offer his dad. He's going to say, I sinned against heaven and against you. I'm not worthy to be called your son. Would you just make me one of your servants? So he's trying to go home. There's a picture that just came up. It was the last painting by Rembrandt. It was painted in 1668. He died a year later. Rembrandt is known for a number of things. One of the things is he painted over 60 self-portraits. You could think he was a narcissist, I suppose. 60 self-portraits. But I think he was trying to figure out who he was. And at the end of his life, he painted one of the most famous paintings in the world. If you go to the Hermitage in St. Petersburg and wait in a really long line, you can see this painting. It's gigantic. I will never forget the first time Lucy and I saw it. It was just there. It just sucked the air out of the room. Tour groups would come by, and when they stepped into that room and saw that painting, everything just hushed. Because that painting pulls you into that story. I suppose there have been hundreds, maybe thousands of artists that have tried to capture the story of the prodigal son. But none of them picked this moment. It's not the climax. This is not when the father rushes to the son and gathers him up and puts a ring on his finger and kills the fatted calf. This is not the denouement, after the climax when everything is settled down. This is that unique moment when you realize it's going to be okay. The hook the boy has been on is finally released. And he can fall into his daddy's arms. And it's one of those moments where the two become one. You know, it's an intriguing story that's captivated the hearts of millions. And I think it's because we all want to go home. But there are things that keep us from going home. You know, when you hear that story, I'm going to guess that you're like me. My heart spins the story in a different way. There are competing narratives to how that story plays out. So I want to take you to one moment in the story when the boy's trying to come to his senses. And I'd like to suggest that it's a battle. It doesn't just happen easy. Why don't you close your eyes for a second? Imagine he's there at the pigsty. Can you smell it? Can you hear the animals rooting around? It's a horrible place. You don't want to be there. But if you look at the railing, I bet if you found the right spot, you'd see your initials carved there. I think all of us spend time there. Can't go home. And he's thinking to himself, okay, listen, I'm going to tell my father I sinned against heaven and him, and I'm just going to want to be a servant here. And his heart is about to get up off of that railing when he hears a competing voice say, "Be careful, boy. You don't want to go home." Let me tell you how this story goes. The boy starts home. He's refreshing his confession. But as he steps into the village where he grew up, he sees in the distance this dust cloud coming his way, and he realizes it's his father running toward him. And his father runs up to him, and he's just about to tell him what he's going to ask. But his father interrupts him before he can say anything at all. And his father, with those great big arms from working in the fields, reaches out and he just makes a fist and he just hits him as hard as he can in the face. And the kid goes down, and then he kicks him in the side. He says, "You piece of trash. How dare you come back? You've humiliated the family. You've impoverished all of us. What are you thinking?" And a part of your heart just grips in fear. You can't go home. What was I thinking? There's no welcome there. And in the twilight of the pigsty, you hear the murmur of assent going, "Now you better stay here." And then another voice picks up the narrative thread and takes it in a different direction. He said, no, the story goes like this. The boy goes home, and he said, "Would you just make me a servant?" And the father says, "Okay." And he hires him on the spot. The boy thinks, "Wow, I can get food, I can clean up." And he starts to work, and he works really hard. And he's thinking at first, this is good. Except at night. Because at night, he can hear the laughter of his family in the big house. And he's not there. He lost that. And every day he works really hard in the field because he hopes his father would notice. But he doesn't. He's just a hired hand. That relationship is taken off the board. Can't really go home. And you feel your heart sink there by the pigsty. And then another voice picks it up and says, no, the boy goes home. He fights his father, and he says, "Oh, I've sinned against heaven and you," and he realizes his father's not looking at him. And he falls to the ground, and he wraps his arms around his daddy's legs, and he goes, "Oh, Daddy, look at me." But his father has killed his heart to his son. He can't see it. There's no relationship there. It's gone. And over you hear different people picking up the story and telling different parts. The one story, he broke the father's heart, and the father left. And you can't go home. There's no home. You destroyed it. And then there's one story. It speaks to me. He goes home. The father runs to meet him. He grabs him. He's excited to see him. And he hears the father saying something that he can't discern what it is. And finally, he captures the words, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." And he thinks, "Well, what do you mean?" And the father says, "Well, when you asked for everything, I held nothing back. I gave you absolutely everything that was yours. And there's nothing left." And he realizes it's not that the father doesn't love him, he just can't help it. But that's not the true story. That's just a heart lie that got planted somewhere along the way. Because there at the pigsty, when he comes to his senses, he hears a voice. It's always behind me in my imagination. And it reaches into the deepest depths of the earth and the highest part of heaven, and it pulls the story together the way it only way could be. The boy goes home. And the father's been watching for him. And he won't let the past define the relationship that they had. He wraps him up in his big daddy arms, and he hugs him, and he kisses him. And it's time to celebrate. This one that was dead is alive. It's going to be okay. And I look at that picture, and I think, hey, he's not cleaned up. The fatted calf is chewing his cud. But your spirit can take a breath because you can go home. Because he misses you too. And I look at that painting, and I see it every morning when I walk down the stairs in our little place. And part of my heart misses God. It's really hard to bring all of your heart home. See, the part of the story that trips me up is that last lie. It isn't that God doesn't love you and care about you. He just doesn't have anything left. Your grace runs out. And I know when that lie was planted in my heart. It was the day my father died. I was just a boy when he died. My dad loved me. He told me that every day of my life. My mom and dad were told they couldn't have any children, and then after 13 years they had one. And they decided I was a gift from God and a miracle. And they told me that every day. And I grew up around a man that absolutely loved God. Except he died. And so it wasn't that God didn't love me. Just he wouldn't always be there to help me. 35 years later, Luci, who's been ahead of me spiritually for a long time, was involved in some prayer ministry, and it was making a difference in her life, and I thought, well, I could probably use that. We counsel a lot of people. I wasn't thinking about me. I was thinking about vicariously fixing me through everybody else. Isn't that what we do? But I noticed I had this low-grade anger. There was a part of my heart that hadn't gone home. And so we go to this conference, and circumstances just so arranged it that I found myself wanting to come home. And I couldn't. And I realized it was because my father was in my way. I love my father. I miss him every day. But I had another father who said, I wish you missed me as much as you miss your dad. My dad had become an idol in my life. Didn't just mess up my life, it messed up my marriage. And that day I bowed my head and I said, oh God, I don't want to be an angry man. And it wasn't long before he took me back to the last time I saw my dad. My dad contracted a disease called Guillain-Barré. It's the most common form of paralysis in North America. One day we were throwing a football, and the next day he was totally paralyzed. Put him in an iron lung. All he could do was blink his eyes. He was an Eagle Scout. We didn't know he knew Morse code. And a couple of days into it, we realized he was trying to communicate with us with his eyes. We eventually worked out a crude little system, and he told us a joke he'd been thinking about. And then he said, it's going to be okay. God hasn't changed. And for the next 4 months, I would visit my father in the hospital down in Denver. And I watched a strapping man of 210 pounds wither down to 80 pounds. And for the first time in my life, I let that part of my heart that I had left blocked out. Because I never really mourned his death. I didn't get mad at God. I just kind of went on. And poor Lucy's sitting there in this huge auditorium, and her husband has totally lost his mind. I finally start to mourn the loss of my father. And I went back and remembered the antiseptic smell and the rhythm of that iron lung and everything. I remembered the first time I put my hand over the hole in his throat as he was trying to teach him to talk. I finally said goodbye to my dad. I finally learned what that verse that says, blessed are those that mourn, they will be comforted, means. And my life changed that day. Because my father loved me and he loved God, and he had taken me as a boy like an arrow and a bow, and he had pulled me back and pointed me at the heart of God, but then he died, and that part of my heart had been stuck forever. And that day the string finally released, and I just flew into God's embrace. That was the day God became Daddy. could smell him in the folds of his garment. I could feel his heart beating against my heart. And he healed a part of my heart that couldn't come home before. That's why I like that. Because you see two hearts pressed up against each other. It's the only way I know to heal a heart. And I'm guessing that all of us carry some hurt, some father wounds. And they can spin the story in all sorts of horrible ways. Because the reality is that he misses you too. He misses you so much, he would rather die than spend eternity without the possibility of you being there too. It's a homecoming. What a perfect time. Come home. You miss him? Parts of my heart, I don't know that I've ever taken my whole heart to him. It comes in bits and pieces. But maybe there's a part of your heart. Time to bring it home. Because he misses you too. Come on.
Gary was 13 when his father departed. I was 18. When my father died, I couldn't cry. I couldn't even feel it. I remember the next morning he died in a construction accident here in West Palm. It was front page news, which I knew he would have liked. And I sat on my bed and I told myself, he's dead. He's dead. He's dead, but I couldn't feel it. I remember walking through the memorial and knowing it was the grace of God, knowing at some level that God would take a tragedy and redeem it, knowing that, but not feeling anything. And I didn't know that I was stuck in a coping mechanism that I had started as an early child to, I'm just not going to feel pain. And I was 18, I was still in the cool years, right? I hadn't come home to Daddy. Years later, I married Gary. We tasted the joy of intimacy for a while, but pretty soon I couldn't feel anything for him either. I was dead. Just in that coping mechanism of I'm not going to feel any pain, and love means pain. And one night, Gary and I were watching a movie that reminded him of his dad. It was called To Kill a Mockingbird. A very noble, honorable dad. And it had come out not long after Gary's dad had departed, and we were laying in bed and getting ready to pray, and Gary just starts talking to God, and he said, Father God, I don't know how things work up there, but if it would make any difference, would you tell my dad I love him? And I thought, that's the sweetest thing I've ever heard. And then I thought, why have I never thought to do that? My dad's been gone a long time. And with that honest thought came a movement from God's Spirit inside me. And I sensed he said, Lucy, sit on the side of the bed now. Tell me everything you wish you'd ever told your father. I'll do with it what needs to be done. And I sat in front of my husband, this Humble Yourself song that he said. I sat like a little girl. And I said, thank you. And I came to realize that everything I had materially from my dad, what for my life, food, clothing, shelter, school, college education, grad school, this ring on my finger, were all gifts from my father. But I grew up in a time in American culture where fathers and daughters generally weren't all that warm to each other. And I didn't know that kind of closeness, and I had shut down my heart to the giving and receiving and the humbling of being a daughter. I was a good daughter. I was a high-achieving daughter. But I was not a loving or a warm daughter. And that night, I get an access to God the Father by finally honoring my earthly father for what he could give me and what he did give me. And we all do. I remember even just a few months ago, because this has been a long journey, but I remember walking around my house and saying out loud, I do not want what my parents couldn't do or didn't do to matter more than what they could do and they did do. We all have histories. We all have some kinds of parents. In those histories are buried treasures. They may be obvious treasures, but for some they're buried. They may be buried under trash. They may be buried under tragedies. But God can redeem the tragedy. He can tear away and cleanse away the trash, and he can give you the treasures of your childhood. We just have to come to him. And he has access to departed. If there are things that are on your heart that you wish that you had said, you don't need to talk to the departed. You can talk to the one who has defeated death, who is sitting at the right hand of God, who invites us to a table, who says, do this in remembrance of me. And as you take the cup and drink, as you take the bread and eat, invite him to bring up in you anything that's standing in the way of you coming home. Unforgiveness, dishonor, lack of gratitude. Say in your heart, I want the treasures. All my life you've been putting treasures in my heart. That's what I want to walk in. And I want to be free to come home. And so I invite you to come to the table. And I don't know exactly how we do this here, but I invite you. Do we just come? And be in that place with the Lord. And then come home. He's died for everything that you've ever done and everything that's been ever done to you. It all can be healed. It all can be redeemed. And none of it has to keep us from the Father.